Welcome to the Shar School Power Lunch. This week, it's a roundtable on climate change policy. Drought, heat, fires, storms, disease. We have begun to witness the instability of an Earth out of balance. But while its drivers proliferate, new solutions also emerge. How can economies be both competitive and sustainable? What is next for policymaking? What new technology is on the horizon that can change the game? The Power Lunch welcomes Janie Bavishi, Director of the New York City Mayor's Office of Resiliency; Andrew Light, former Senior Advisor to the U.S. Special Envoy on Climate Change and University Professor at George Mason University; and Robinson Meyer, Environment and Technology Reporter for The Atlantic and the author of the newsletter, The Weekly Planet. Rising seas do not respect borders. Contaminated air flows uninhibited. Climate change, of course, is the most global of problems, but it is subject to national and local politics. Welcome to the Power Lunch. I'm Justin Guest. I'm an associate professor here at the Shar School of Policy and Government. We are fortunate today to be joined by Janie Bavishi, Andrew Light, and Robinson Meyer. Thank you so much for joining the broadcast, everyone. Rob, could you please set the scene for us? After 4 years of a Trump administration that has methodically sought to dismantle a variety of environmental standards and policies, what is the state of America's commitment to addressing climate change, and what challenges are facing the incoming Biden administration?
Well, absolutely. I mean, first of all, you can't say enough about how much the Trump administration has undermined climate policy at every turn. From just the basics of EPA air pollution regulation and car efficiency and car fuel mileage standard regulation to actually changing how the EPA can even make regulations to make it harder to fight climate change and to make it harder to just regulate environmental issues at all. We've seen that across the government under Trump. So any place where there is interest in mitigating climate change, in fighting climate change, be it at the state level, be it from financial institutions, be it from big companies, the Trump administration, especially now, even during these final weeks of its time in power, has looked for ways to weaken that power. We see this now with the administration trying to change the kinds of places where people can put retirement money to kind of discourage pro-climate investing from retirement savers. At the same time, if you look back over the past 4 years, while we've had this concerted move from the Trump administration to weaken America's commitment to fighting climate change and to weaken kind of the power of the federal government to do anything about it and the power of the US government to do anything about it, we've seen, first of all, states and cities step up or at least commit to stepping up, commit to kind of fighting climate change on their own. And we've also seen companies step up, and companies take this much more seriously than they were 4 years ago. That's partly driven by just the fact that climate impacts have intensified over the past 4 years. I mean, if you think about 4 years ago, or you think about 2015, 2016, we had these California wildfires, but they were beginning to get bad, but they were not yet at the regularly catastrophic levels that we've seen the past 4 years. You know, that kind of natural disaster has made insurance companies and financial institutions step up and want to fight climate change in a more sincere way, I think, than they were talking about in 2015 or 2016. So the new Biden administration faces this interesting landscape where the federal government has weaker powers than it used to be and has a lot of work to do to just even put the ship back together in terms of environmental policy. At the same time, states and cities have laid the groundwork for the past 4 years and are kind of ready to keep moving and ready to get help from the federal government. And companies seem like they want something to be done, and they seem like they're ready to do something too, and they're exerting pressure in their own ways. And I think as we look at the Biden administration, we're going to see folks like Treasury Secretary designate Janet Yellen look at how to kind of, just as the Trump administration has figured out how to use, non-environmental regulatory parts of the government to fight the fight against climate change. We're going to see things like financial regulation or Department of Labor regulation, ag regulation start to really think about speeding the energy transition and fighting climate change in a serious way.
Very interesting. Yeah, I mean, climate policy really up until now has been divided and often between what people call adaptation and mitigation. And Janie, much of your work focuses on adaptation to climate change. Can you please describe the nature of this approach and maybe offer a report card of U.S. progress on adaptation right now?
Sure, I'm happy to. So as Robinson talked about, we must go through the clean energy transition. We have to transition our energy in order to essentially curb the rate of climate change. We need to slow the rate of climate change down. But at this point, we are already seeing the impacts of climate change. We have crossed a threshold that basically means that there are going to be impacts that we cannot avoid. And there are things that we have to do to change our physical environments, potentially to change the way that we live, in some cases change where we live, in order to adapt to those impacts, in order to prepare for those impacts of climate change. These are measures that we can take to make our communities safer, to make our cities safer, but they're also often solutions that allow us to improve the quality of life in our communities, there are things that we can do to make our communities more equitable as well. So in New York City, where I work, we are advancing a suite of solutions and really taking a multi-layered approach to adapting to the impacts of climate change. In New York City, we're facing up to 30 inches of sea level rise by the 2050s. We're facing more intense coastal storms. We're facing more rain, which is significant because it means that there's going to be flooding inland, not just in coastal communities. And we're also facing hotter temperatures. We expect 3 times the number of 90-degree days or above 90 degrees by the 2050s than we're facing now. And those impacts are also significant because they often impact our most vulnerable residents, older adults, those with chronic disabilities or other illnesses, and often those who are living in poorer communities. So we're taking a suite of measures to prepare for those impacts, whether it's at the shoreline, protecting our coast, upgrading our buildings, hardening our infrastructure and critical services, and then also working with communities to improve social cohesion, invest in our community anchors and social infrastructure like small businesses, and just providing information to residents so that they can make more informed decisions. In terms of a report card, there is a lot of work to do. I'm happy to report in New York City, we're actually leading the way in many ways because we had access to $20 billion of funding after Sandy. More than $15 billion of that came from federal funds. But that's part of the problem. Much of the resources that localities need to take these measures to adapt to the impacts of climate change are flowing only after a disaster. And we need to be able to access these resources more proactively in order to take proactive action.
What do you think the Biden administration would need to do in order to earn an A+ when it comes to adaptation for the country?
There's a lot. I think that there's, as Robinson said on mitigation, the same goes for adaptation. The Trump administration has undone a lot of the structures that and policies that were in place. And so we need to put that back together. Things like, just creating spaces for coordination among federal agencies, because there's no one agency responsible for adaptation. We need to draw on the authorities and the programs of multiple agencies, especially on complicated issues like relocating entire communities. We need to bake adaptation and accounting for climate impacts into a range of federal grant programs. This can't just be something that we deal with after disaster. Like I said, every infrastructure grant needs to account for the impacts of climate change so that we're not building bridges that get washed out after every coastal storm or tarmac that melts in the heat, right? We need to be accounting for these climate impacts with every new investment. It's just the fiscally responsible thing to do. We also need to rebuild our federal science enterprise. We need to be working from, all of our work on adaptation needs to be scientifically sound, and it needs to be based on the best available information. And the federal government really holds a lot of that data. So we need to rebuild that. And I think that there's also an opportunity to really think about adaptation as part of any of the work to recover from the current COVID crisis and the current economic crisis. Any investment we make should be preparing for the next crisis that we face. And so, really setting those infrastructure standards, investing in jobs, and investing in some of the social gaps that we've seen through COVID, making sure that we have systems to build social cohesion, to rebuild the social safety net. All of those things help us prepare for the climate impacts that we are seeing now and will continue to see.
Now, Andrew, much of your work focuses on mitigation. Could you please describe the nature of this approach and offer a report card from your perspective of U.S. progress on climate change mitigation right now?
Sure. The mitigation is core to the solutions to climate change. Effectively, is you're stopping climate pollution. You're stopping the reliance on greenhouse gases or the creation of greenhouse gases, and the things that produce them, primarily as carbon dioxide is a byproduct of burning fossil fuels to create energy. So you're coming up with alternatives to that in order to stop climate pollution, which is causing warming. The biggest bucket there is alternative energy sources in the electricity sector, transportation, but it's got to go deeper and deeper than that if we're to really achieve our primary mitigation goals, which the world is coalescing on now to hit something around net zero emissions by 2050, which will happen sooner than we think. It is a massive transformation. It's also a massive opportunity, because every time you substitute or you build a new power plant, you're creating jobs, you're creating a commodity that consumers buy. Same thing is true with alternative transportation solutions, and on and on and on, in agriculture, in industrial sectors, in the production of steel, cement, everything else. The other big bucket for mitigation is to create more carbon sinks. So, we do this mostly in the world now with trees and other vegetable matter. So trees and other green things absorb carbon dioxide, so that's very good. Some of the biggest gains we've made in the last 20 years in terms of reducing emissions has been by expanding stocks of forests, especially south of the equator in places like Brazil, now threatened, but still, that's where we've gotten a lot of those gains. And now people are working in earnest on more advanced ways of doing this, including things like what's called direct air capture. So coming up with different ways you can just suck carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and safely store it somewhere underground or convert it into some kind of usable project. The combination, that's where kind of the net zero comes in. If you're still going to be burning some kind of fossil fuels in the future for some part of your energy or industrial needs, you got to balance that out with either natural carbon sinks or some other kind of process that's going to reduce emissions. Fundamentally, though, what we've got to do on the reduction in emissions side is to basically, you want to decouple economic growth from growth in emissions, especially in carbon dioxide. One of the ways to think about why it's so difficult, it's been taking us so long to do things like negotiate global agreements on climate change, which is something I did for the US government in the second half of the Obama administration, is because one way to think about it is carbon dioxide is a byproduct of the engine that's traditionally driven global prosperity. It's almost an iron law of development now that if a population is in the state of energy poverty, if they don't have access to electricity, they can't get out of poverty unless they've intentionally arranged their world and their lives so that they don't rely on electricity. And in that respect, there's sort of no government around the world of a country of any major scale and size which can just turn off the taps on electricity and stay in power, stay in office. So you've really got to sort of figure out a way you can continue economic growth and not make that reliant on the growth in emissions. And we have been getting there in the world. We've been pretty close, especially in the electricity sector, not as much in sort of other sectors, but a few years ago, we'd managed to sort of see economic growth go up and emissions go down globally. That has happened in a lot of particular countries in the world. we're not as in good a shape now, but we're sort of right there, I think, at an inflection point where we can imagine that happening. And in addition to that, we've got to take on, there are other greenhouse gases, methane, hydrofluorocarbons, black carbon, which is soot, and other areas where we can also imagine lots of policies for mitigation, which could also help us to relieve some of the pressure that we're feeling now on the steady production of climate pollution.
Very interesting. And Rob, there are those who believe that technological advancement, like the kind that Andrew was suggesting here, will be more critical than political decisions in mitigating the threat of climate change. So innovations like geoengineering or carbon sequestration will be really key developments, not something like a Green New Deal as an alternative. Could you please tell us about these advances and what you make of that argument?
Yeah, absolutely. So I was very interested to hear Andrew talk about direct air capture. There's a number of different technologies that we could be talking about here. In some ways, there's almost too many to go into detail. The most important are wind and solar energy, and specifically solar energy, because as the IEA said earlier this year, it is now the cheapest form of electricity in history. I think it may be the cheapest form of energy in history. It has gotten extraordinarily cheap, and solar energy is going to be key to any climate change mitigation strategy, really like any economic growth strategy, frankly, for the United States or any developed country going forward, period. There's just no question it is so cheap, and it opens up kind of so many doors in that respect. And it's zero carbon, of course, so it's good. Then there's a number of other technologies, as you said. I think the one that is the most interesting right now is direct air capture, is this idea in some form, or carbon removal in some form. Direct air capture kind of tends to refer to basically putting a giant machine that's like a factory-sized machine in various places, kind of above geological limestone, like deep in the ground. You put a big factory at the ground level, and it sucks in air, and it uses a process that we actually are chemically very familiar with to suck the CO2 out of that air, and then it sends that CO2 down into the ground and sequesters it in limestone, at which point it's sequestered for thousands of years. There are reasons to really like DAC, or is direct air capture, so DAC, as we call it. There's reasons to really like it. There's some sectors, like aviation, for instance, where just because of the energy density of like jet fuel versus anything else, including batteries or hydrogen, it's very hard to see how we do kind of long haul aviation in a decarbonized world. And of course, if you have DAC, it's much easier because you just have planes and then you suck the carbon out of the sky emitted by the planes. DAC also would let us fix climate change over time, right? So right now we have quite elevated, climate change is happening because CO2, like ambient CO2 levels in the atmosphere, are higher than they've been in hundreds of thousands of years. Eventually, we are going to need to fix that, probably. Certainly, if we want to avoid warming, we need to fix that. And we would do that by just bringing CO2 levels down and sequestering the CO2 geologically. There's many other technologies I could talk about here, and there's increasing enthusiasm for funding them, which is something we haven't seen in about a decade from American investors, which is good because none of them are going to advance without funding. But none of them are also going to advance without public support. And I think I would want to kind of challenge maybe the idea that the politics here and the technology here are different, or that they're unrelated questions. I think what we've seen over the past 20 years, frankly, and really since the kind of modern era of climate politics started, is that the more you can afford, the more you can do. And not even affording isn't even the question. It's like the more that's cheap, the more you can do. And there's a ton of climate policy we can do now. There's a ton of climate policy that is going to be available to the Biden administration that wasn't available to the first term Obama administration, or even to the second term Obama administration, because renewable energy is so much cheaper now. So for instance, if you make utilities have to compete on price a little bit more, and have to make electricity generation compete on price a little bit more, then you're just knocking out a lot of fossil fuel combustion, frankly, because solar will come in and replace it. I think at the same time, none of those technologies, like many of the kind of breakthrough technologies that we're going to need a decade or 2 decades from now as we continue this transition from a carbon heavy energy system to a zero carbon energy system, still require public support. And that's very normal. You know, like most high technologies, nearly all high technologies, including the internet, including silicon, chips that have succeeded in the US have required some form of public support to take hold, and that's just a normal part of the U.S. policy playbook historically. So I would say I'm very excited by these technologies. I think they're going to make a ton possible, and I think they're going to make a ton like politically possible, because the more that they're available, the kind of friendlier the economics and the political economics of fighting climate change will be. At the same time, like we need public support to keep pushing the prices of those things down, so that then in 10 years or in 15 years or in 5 years, if there's a friendly administration in 5 years, we will be able to continue, we will be able to take those technologies that are now cheaper and actually use them to mitigate carbon and put them in the energy system.
Right. Just come in just a second,
Please.
I completely agree with all that. Let me add a couple more nuances to this. And I'm sure that Robinson would agree with me. One is that I agree, like the buckets, the existing technologies we have, which can always be improved and the efficiency can improve, but they're there. They are on the shelf. They're ready to deploy. They're being deployed. There's the stuff that doesn't yet exist, or it does exist, but it's not yet commercially viable yet, like direct air capture. And so we need to advance in more deployment of the former, and we need a lot of cooperation and more intensive research in different countries to do the latter, to do the sort of the more cutting edge technology, whether it's direct air capture or hydrogen or advanced carbon capture and sequestration for existing fossils or what have you. The really good news on this is that it's not only something that developed countries can do, but developing countries as well. Solar power is cost competitive with fossils in most of India at this point. It's not just in wealthy countries. And so the possibility of really going global with the stuff that exists now is extraordinary. And in fact, the Indian government in the run up to Paris, when the leaders were all in Paris before we got down to the 2 weeks of finishing the negotiations, a lot of them came and made a lot of big announcements. And Prime Minister Modi came there and sort of announced a new program called the International Solar Alliance, where he wants India to lead on a kind of a South-South cooperation around the world and expanding solar power. So that's terrific. The other part of this, and maybe this is just a connecting the dots here, the way Robinson put it, is it's not just the technology, it's public support. In the middle, of course, the secret sauce, right? And this is often the hardest part, are what are the policy instruments that make those two things come together? And this is where there are a lot of options for the Biden administration, but interestingly, some of them are constrained at the moment now in ways that they had not been in the past. So we might have sort of said in the past, there were sort of regulatory instruments on the one side and market mechanisms on the other, with a lot of kind of stuff in between of various shades of gray. Market mechanisms are not very popular right now, even in the environmental movement. And so the degree to which you could sort of rely on that, if you agree that those work, as a sort of a way for the Biden administration to go forward, even if there was congressional support, which is always a big if, is a more difficult conversation, frankly, now than it was 10 years ago when we were doing the Waxman-Markey bill, right? The big comprehensive climate bill in the United States. It was going through the House of Representatives in 2009. And then now, people are kind of really kind of looking at, especially the kinds of policies that have been done in New York State and other places, standards and measures, right, that could work in other ways to get a regulatory approach to do this. And finding that sweet spot, especially if we're looking at a Biden administration which has the most ambitious climate plans of any administration in U.S. history, far and away. Biden wants to spend $2 trillion in the next 4 years on climate solutions, adaptation, mitigation, everything. So you've got a lot of ambition. If you still got Republican control of the Congress, of the Senate, then what's the array of measures right there that are connect that public support and the technological solutions that Robinson framed up for you?
Right. And, speaking of these standards, Andrew, and Janie, much of your emphasis in New York City has been on guidelines for buildings and infrastructure and the creation of these standards. Can you tell us a little bit about the connection between these standards and climate change?
Sure. I mean, I'll speak from an adaptation perspective first. We're very lucky in New York City, first of all, that we, by local law, are mandated to work with an independent panel of scientists that provide us with local climate projections every 3 years. So these climate projections end up being the foundation of our entire resilience program. As I said before, we're spending over $20 billion in adaptation and resilience measures, it's these local the climate scientists that provide us with the information that really guides us on how to spend that money. But the fact of the matter is that we can't just be thinking about adaptation projects in a silo. We can't just be waiting in the current structure to access federal resources every time there is a disaster. So we need to really mainstream this thinking about how to account for climate impacts in every dollar that we're spending. We have a $90 billion capital budget. And so we released these guidelines. We created these guidelines based on projections for extreme heat, intense precipitation, sea level rise, and coastal storms. And they provide guidance to designers and engineers on how to incorporate those projections into buildings and infrastructure projects. This is really significant because it means that we will not be just waiting for the next flood protection project to get funded in order to invest in adaptation. We will be thinking about adaptation in every DOT street project, in every drainage project, in every wastewater treatment plant, in every library that's built. And that's the kind of culture we basically need to be building around adaptation in order to rise to the challenge. We're also doing this on the mitigation side. One of the things that our analysis shows, and I think it's pretty well known at this point, that 80% of New York City's carbon emissions actually comes from our buildings. And so now by local law, we have passed a buildings mandate that phases in clean energy goals over the next 10 years, 20 years, and beyond. Again, it's significant because, well, this is now legally mandated. And actually, I should say the climate resilience design guidelines for adaptation are also have been introduced in the city council as a local law, starting with a pilot program and then moving into a mandate. But because our emissions, so the bulk of our emissions comes from our buildings, this local law will now create the enabling environment, create the mandate to transform our buildings so that we are making the clean energy transformation, at least at the buildings level.
And much of your background personally, Janie, is in disaster recovery, but it seems like the present impacts of climate change are not only large, infrequent events like hurricanes, but also the incremental rise of extreme temperatures. Are there lessons here about disaster recovery that you think can be applied to climate concerns more broadly then?
Absolutely. It's interesting. Some of the things that we've learned from disasters are things like the importance of first responders, right? It's usually the community-based groups, the faith-based groups, houses of worship that are the ones on the ground in communities after a disaster that are working to make sure their neighbors are okay, that first aid is provided, that people are evacuating if they need to evacuate. We're learning from those kinds of examples and actually intentionally investing in building social cohesion in communities to respond to things like extreme heat. Extreme heat is known as a silent killer because most of the people that are impacted by extreme heat, they die inside their homes or they get sick inside their homes because they don't realize that they're being impacted and they don't seek access to a cool space, or even simple things like turn their air conditioner on or just make sure they're staying hydrated. So we've actually invested in community-based organizations to recruit volunteers and buddy those. The program's called Be a Buddy. We actually create these buddy networks between volunteers and vulnerable residents so that people are checking in on each other during a heat wave, making sure that people are doing small things to stay safe. It's really interesting. We've activated our Be a Buddy network more during COVID than we ever have before. And it really goes to show that these adaptation measures that are motivated by climate change can actually help to make sure that we're staying safe and staying prepared for a variety of different kinds of stresses that we may face in society.
Very interesting. We could all use a buddy, I think, during COVID for lots of, variety of reasons for the sake of social cohesion. Andrew, President-elect Biden has announced that John Kerry will serve as the U.S. Special Envoy for Climate in his administration. Can you talk a little bit about this role and what you think The reason was that John Kerry was selected to be the sort of warrior for this cause, as opposed to a climate change specialist.
Well, look, I think that if there's any American politician who has a claim of being a climate change specialist, it's John Kerry. So John Kerry's been living and breathing this stuff, for decades and decades, going back to his years in Congress. And having worked for a time in the Secretary's office, I can attest that he knows as much about this as most anyone across a range of issues. He's about as well informed as you'd want any elected official to be. Let's just put it that way. So I think that the important thing here is, let's back up a step. So one of the things that Joe Biden campaigned on, and especially is very prominent in his campaign plans going back to, he had two sets of them. One set that came out in the summer of 2019, or just beginning of the summer of 2019, and then one in last summer in 2020, is that he wanted to put climate change at the center of foreign policy. And that's something that a lot of us who've been doing this for a number of years have always said is the aspiration you want to get to, that climate change should be as important as national security concerns, because it is a national security concern, as trade and economic issues, that we put traditionally at the center of foreign policy, as human rights issues, which in the past it was not, didn't even rise to that level. And so, but how do you actually do that? How do you implement that? We're pretty good on what would that mean in terms of the outcomes. You would prioritize, for example, the success of the Paris Agreement, which gets countries to come forward every 5 years and increase their targets and measures until you hit these temperature targets that we've all agreed to, going back to 2015. But how do you make that happen? And I was involved in a bunch of different overlapping processes over the last 9 months, trying to come up with ideas of how you do that and implement it. And none of those processes came up with what Joe Biden and John Kerry had figured out, which is that you actually have to put someone at the most senior level of foreign policy in the United States who's going to be at the table when all of the issues of foreign policy that rise to the level of the president get decided. So the structure of this is that John Kerry is now the presidential envoy for climate change. We had a special envoy for climate change that I worked for, was in the State Department in the Obama administration. Now it's in the White House, that position is. And not only does that mean that you've got a special presidential envoy always talking to the president about what they're going to do internationally to create cooperation on climate change, but also that person now has a seat on the Security Council. And the Security Council by statute is 6 people, the president, the vice president, secretaries of Treasury, State, Treasury, State, Energy, and Defense, sorry, blank there for a second. And there are others who are in the room, depending on the issue that's being talked about. Now there's going to be a 7th seat, and the seat is for someone whose job it is to look at every issue of foreign policy, because Security Council doesn't just do security narrowly, like when we're fighting wars, but all major issues of foreign policy, and scrutinizing what are going to be the impacts of that particular issue and the decisions that are made on it with respect to climate change and climate cooperation. That is what it means to put climate change at the center of U.S. foreign policy. Now there's going to be a whole team that will build out, I'm sure, that will be supporting Kerry in doing this from across different agencies and government. And this is a more prominent place that climate change has been represented at leader-level decision-making on a daily basis than I think has ever been done anywhere else in the world. The Chinese, for a long time, had a very influential, and still do, very influential ambassador or minister for climate change, Minister Xia. I don't think Minister Xia ever had access to every issue of foreign policy that went before the president of China, which is what you have now. And if you think about it, if you're going to add a 7th person, right, to that room, whenever they meet, it's got to be someone of the stature of John Kerry. It's got to be someone who was a senior member of the cabinet before, because only that would be the kind of person who could demand respect on that. Now, we full well expect that there will also be a domestic counterpart to Kerry's position, to be announced maybe next week, don't know, being discussed now, who will then, those 2 offices are going to have to work really closely together. But just in terms of the enormity of the decision that's been made here, I think that think about it in terms of all those issues that we've been talking about for years, where climate impacts foreign policy. This is going to be the glue, right, to really actually make that happen. And someone there whose job it is to crank the levers of government to make sure that the climate considerations get considered. And I think this is one of the best things that they've announced so far.
Great. Let me just remind our viewers that we're very interested in your questions too. I'm not the only one who gets to ask questions. Please do put them into the live comment box, and we'll collect them and ask them closer to the top of the hour. Let's shift now, though, from policy to politics. Rob, on February 21st of this year, that feels so long ago, you published an article entitled, quite bluntly, "Voters Really Care About Climate Change." That was it. In the face of a massive global pandemic now, of course, a nationwide recession and a reckoning about social justice, do you think voters still care? Does Biden really have a mandate, or at least as much of a mandate when it comes to the climate?
Well, yes, February 21st, luckily, 3 or 4 political universes ago. I think, yes, but which voters? I think what we've seen this cycle is that, yes, but it's tricky and polling is hard. I'd put it like this. I think what we've seen this cycle is that there was a lot of jockeying over climate policy during the primary, which happened to end basically a week after I wrote that piece. And there were candidates like Jay Inslee, there was really just Jay Inslee who entered the primary with an extremely ambitious climate plan, with the goal of putting it front and center for the other candidates, and I would say succeeded in doing so. At the same time, you had a kind of insurgent environmental left movement that was pretty coalitionally connected to Senator Sanders, and I think negotiated its role. I'm talking about Sunrise here and a number of other groups, but kind of then negotiated its role through the primary as being fundamentally kind of born of the Sanders 2016 campaign, or at least the energy brought forth by the Sanders 2016 campaign, while also trying to exert influence on policy. And I'd say they did a fair job of that. They were pretty harsh to Biden during the primary, but after the primary ended, members of those movements did a huddle with the Biden campaign and put together policy. And if you look at Biden's proposal, as Andrew said, $2 trillion spent on climate change over the next few years is by far and away the most ambitious and just the most commitment we've seen from a presidential administration ever. And I would say the kind of exactly what Andrew was just talking about too, the cross-sectional approach, the idea that Janet Yellen is going to the Treasury Department talking about how they're going to fight climate change and how Treasury and financial regulations have a role to play in fighting climate change. Totally unprecedented from anything we've seen before from administration. And that's all because of the energy around climate change in the primary. I think what we've learned now since then it's two things. I mean, Biden did really use climate cannily as a political issue to hold his electoral coalition together. And one reason he's so ambitious and aggressive on climate, I think, is because it's a big issue for young voters and for for young Democrats, for young progressive Democrats, and for all the kind of inherent qualities of that group. It's a more diverse group, it's a more educated group, it's a more ideological group. Climate change is a big issue for them. He used it definitely during the general election to hold his Democratic coalition together. And so he went very hard on climate and really emphasized it, I think, as a way of basically successfully bringing that Bernie wing of the party into the fold. At the same time, what we saw is that Biden was straightforward about what his policies would mean for the oil industry. And I think I'm interested to see going forward how much that might have hurt him in Texas, specifically in the Rio Grande Valley, where a lot of the really good paying jobs are in the oil industry. Now, at the same time, it's so hard to talk about an election in demographic terms until basically you get good exit polls, and you don't get good exit polls till like 6 months from now. So what we've also learned is there was basically a Latino swing against Biden. Biden won most Latin voters, and he also lost a large share of them compared to 2016 to Trump. It wasn't just in the Rio Grande Valley. Maybe it had nothing to do with the oil industry. But I think what we're discovering is that that climate change is a quite potent issue for the Democratic coalition, and how it plays at a national level in some of these geographies that Democrats would really like to win and kind of need to win is still a question. In some ways, this is has always been the issue, because I've published research that looked at the 2016 election that found counties where fracking was especially a big deal in Ohio and Pennsylvania really swung hard against Clinton. So this is always the negotiation. You have some voters who really care about climate change, and you have some who are really connected to the kind of political economy of the oil industry and vote on that basis. I would say that what we did learn this year is that for the first time, I think, climate change is a big issue for Democrats. And it's a coalitional issue for Democrats. It's in fact what brings that coalition together in some ways. And I don't think that is likely to change soon.
Janie, cities often get caught in the web of federal and state preemption, especially for blue cities in red states. Mayors find themselves stuck inside and under state or federal laws. Now, New York City, of course, is a blue city that's in a relatively blue state, but you do have some tension between the governor and the mayor. What can you tell us here about the implications for climate policy? Particularly, from your experience, underneath state and federal regulations, but also what you observe elsewhere where you do have blue cities in relatively red states.
Yeah, I mean, this all goes back to funding, and I feel like, I keep beating the same horse over and over and over again. But, a lot of funding, and especially disaster funding, goes through states before it can reach cities. And even with the politics that we do in New York, we often find that those decisions can be politically motivated, right? So we will put forward incredibly, what we think are good proposals to the state for funding as FEMA funds FEMA funds reach the state, and often the decisions are made that those funds are going to go elsewhere in the state and not to New York. New York City is in an incredibly privileged position. We have put a lot of skin in the game, but funding either from the federal government or from the state directly can be a really important catalyst to getting some of these adaptation projects going. Let me give you an example. The East Side Coastal Resiliency Project is a 2.5 mile long coastal protection project that will protect the Lower East Side from future coastal storms. This is an area that where 110,000 people live, 28,000 in public housing. It's an incredibly important project. It's an area that was devastated by Hurricane Sandy. It is now a $1.45 billion project. It started with $335 million from HUD. But I don't, and the rest of the investment is from the city. So the city, like I said, has skin in the game for sure. But I don't think we would have ever gotten there without that initial investment from HUD. It was an important catalyst to getting city leaders interested, to getting the community rallied around it. And it ultimately got the planning process kickstarted so that we could get to this really unprecedented project in a dense urban environment like New York City. So, it always comes back to funding. We need access to funding. If there are ways to get funding directly to cities, especially, I think it will only help cities take the proactive action that they need to take to prepare for these impacts.
Got it. Andrew, because of the link between carbon emissions, in a lot of cities and economic growth in the way that you described earlier, many worry that COVID will actually cause climate policy to take a back seat until the world economy fully recovers. Now, back in May, China, one of the world's largest emitters, dropped its main climate target metric. Now, the Paris Climate Agreement signatories, as you well know, are meeting tomorrow on its 5th anniversary to renew and review their pledges. How does one convince the world that they should care about the climate even in the middle of a global recession?
Well, one way to do it is to demonstrate, and we've actually been through this before, that one of the ways in which you can recover from a massive economic recession is through action on climate change, or through some kind of green growth or green stimulus. And we went through this in 2008, 2009, the last great recession. And the preponderance of evidence that's out there, it's not all completely, causally sort of laid out in a nice nifty package. But if you look at all of the different stimulus packages that were done by different countries around the world, Korea spent the biggest proportion of its stimulus on what would broadly conceive of as green measures. It also emerged out of the recession faster than any OECD country. Now, that's just kind of one example, but there are lots of other examples where we can actually track it down job for job for job, jobs that were created by green measures. Look at the stimulus package that Obama put forward in 2009, the ERA Act, right, which he did in less than a month after inauguration in 2009. And that act had about 20%, right, of it was devoted to, so $800 billion, about 20% was devoted to what we call clean energy measures, the biggest clean energy bill ever passed in U.S. history. We can track the job growth out of there, and it's one of the things that created one of the biggest job creators in the United States, which is the renewable energy industry. So we've got a lot of evidence on this and a lot of good thinking that's gone into it. The International Energy Agency put out a great report on this several months back, looking at the sort of the possibilities for green recovery, and again, sector by sector by sector, what were the possibilities for injecting money into these areas, and how you could do that. So that's kind of on the job creation side. And then, Janie kind of already mentioned this in part with her example of the buddy system. It turns out that a lot of the solutions set for climate change are also exactly the kind of things you want to put in place if we get another, big pandemic or some other kind of set of disasters that set us back in some kind of way. So the resilience, the hardening measures that you do in response to the threats of climate change have a very tight fit over other kinds of things that we want to be prepared for. And this will help to save us money down the road. It becomes a smart way to grow. Now, one thing I just want to sort of say is that I'm part of something called the America's Pledge Project, which is the World Resources Institute and the Rocky Mountain Institute, University of Maryland, and others. And we've been tracking all this subnational or non-federal action that Robinson mentioned at the beginning when he's talking about all the state action that's happening. It is enormous. It's extraordinary. If you take New York State, right, and New York City, and the 24 other states and U.S. territories that are part of what's called the U.S. Climate Alliance, and the hundreds of cities and thousands of businesses that are committed to staying in the Paris Agreement and committed to fulfilling the original U.S. pledges to the Paris Agreement, it's about 4,000 entities. You put them all together and you made them their own country, it would be the second largest economy in the world, bigger than China, right? There'd be the whole U.S. economy, this climate coalition that's really come together since President Trump announced on June 1st, 2017, that he was going to pull out of the Paris Agreement, and then China. And we've been tracking this year by year by year to sort of see their progress. And we did a report this year that we released in September, really to investigate this proposition. Justin, you sort of said, is it really the case that like this stuff, that's this climate action at the non-federal level can't survive something like the economic downturn that we've seen with COVID? And the good news there is that even with no federal support, right, none of the budget support that Janie's been talking about coming from the federal government to help them continue their action plans in New York City, New York State, and other places, even without that, the scorecard is really good. So the electricity sector, the transportation sector, the only thing is building efficiency, because people are building a lot of buildings right now in this economy. Methane, mitigation of methane emissions, on and on and on, hydrofluorocarbons, all these other sort of things that we want to tackle when we're tackling climate change, those have done pretty well, even in the worst economic downturn since the Great Depression. And that is because they do sustain themselves once you get them up and running. Now, This will not be indefinite. This is one of the reasons why in the next stimulus package, we've got to be injecting more money into states and cities, not just for the green recovery reasons, but just for the recovery reasons writ large. But it also is a kind of really good indication of a smart bet for that stimulus and a smart political path that President-elect Biden could take. Because I'm going to bet you that block grants to cities and states, even in red states, are going to get a lot more support from this Congress across the board than new federal programs. And if you're aiming those at expanding that map of states and cities who want to do more on climate change, I think that you can probably build a much stronger coalition for the kind of action we need to see moving forward.
Very interesting. And that America's Plague Project is quite the frontier. It's a remarkable idea. Yeah, please.
Can I jump in here too? I just also want to mention that there are opportunities for bipartisan action on adaptation in particular. I mean, as you mentioned at the beginning, Mother Nature does not respect political boundaries when unleashing these extreme events, right? So we're seeing leaders in red municipalities, localities, states, as well as blue and purple, having to deal with the impacts of climate change. And so amazingly, just one anecdote to really underscore the point, I worked at the White House Council on Environmental Quality on Adaptation and Resilience at the end of the Obama administration. And we were working on an executive order that was at the time quite controversial that set a flood standard for every federal infrastructure investment. Essentially, we wanted to make sure that we were accounting for future flood risk in every federal infrastructure investment that was made. And it was done through executive order. Unsurprisingly, the Trump administration rescinded that executive order actually just before Hurricane Harvey hit Texas. Now, essentially, the same policy has been introduced as legislation in the House by a Republican congressman. It's because there's constituent demand for this work. We absolutely have to be incentivizing and investing in these solutions. So I think even if, I think the path on emissions, on decarbonization, probably relies more heavily on executive action if the Senate doesn't flip. However, there are opportunities for bipartisan legislative action on adaptation. You can call it something else if you want, call it disaster risk reduction, call it disaster preparedness, but I think the outcome will be the same.
Very interesting. Yeah, and this is clearly, I think, a space to watch politically because each of you are, I think, pulling at really interesting themes. And then a lot of it also relates to something we haven't talked about, which is intensity, is just how salient the issue becomes on a variety of these campaign trails. Before we hear audience questions, let's just take a few turns focusing on each of your respective specialties. Janie, let's just start with you. Your work obviously takes place at the most local of levels. You're on the front line of urban adaptation and the role of cities in addressing climate change. However, New York City is also abnormally large, is extraordinarily wealthy and well-resourced. But so what are some of the lessons from your experience that you think could work in smaller cities? What here is actually replicable?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think that staying close to the science community wherever you are, there are scientific resources in many metropolitan areas. Make sure that those are informing government decisions. I think that's really important. And I think this lesson of bake this thinking into everything you do. You don't need separate pots of money for all of the solutions that are required for climate change. For some of them, you just need to consider climate change in the things that cities do anyway. So bake it in, mainstream it. I think that's the way to spur climate action without access to new resources.
Very interesting. And Rob, have you seen any innovations at the local level that you think are worth bringing up here?
There we go. I think what Janie said about language is maybe the most compelling. You see a lot of localities that are thinking about this. A lot of congressional districts that are thinking about this too. That are fine to talk about increased flooding. They're fine to talk about sea level rise, actually. And then sometimes I would say specifically Republicans kind of getting out and talking just about sea level rise because in many communities, there is subsidence, like the land is falling in addition to climate change caused sea level rise. So they talk about sea level rise, and they can kind of skirt the climate issue. I would say most of it is around exactly those issues of kind of how do you talk about climate change and do adaptation work without talking about climate change. I think where the kind of maybe next step for localities is actually what we're seeing in California right now, where wildfires have gotten so bad there on such a regular basis that insurers are looking to pull out of the home insurance market. I think up to 20% of California homes could basically have no home insurance option. And that's a really big issue actually to the financial system, because people get 30-year mortgages, but your 30-year mortgage requires you to get home insurance. But home insurance is renewed on a 1-year basis. And if you don't have if you don't renew your home insurance every year, I think are up to, you could lose your mortgage. Now, that is a completely fine system. There's nothing wrong with that system if you assume a house is roughly as insurable 1 year as it is the next year. But of course, between sea level rise and wildfire risk, that's no longer the case. Houses become less and less insurable every year, and it begins to pose a risk to, first of all, just the American financial system, because so much of it is still tied up in real estate and mortgage-backed securities. And then it also starts to pose a risk to just like state budgets and state economic well-being because of property taxes, and also because if 20% of your homeowners lose their mortgage, is a really big deal. So what California at the state level has done is intervene in the home insurance market and actually block home insurers from leaving the state or from abandoning those houses. I actually think that kind of intervention in the insurance market, to the degree where you could start to see something like a Florida model where there's much more involvement in the home insurance industry because it's simply crucial to the state's economic well-being, is maybe the next frontier here.
Very interesting. And then, staying at the national level then, Rob, I know you're following a number of stories about the place of cars in America's attempts to address climate change. And, we just received news that General Motors is not going to go through with a Trump Environmental Protection Agency lawsuit against California's emissions standards for vehicles. Why are the politics of cars the space to watch in the U.S.? And before you answer, you recently wrote in The Atlantic about the Zero Emission Transportation Association, or I think it's called ZETA, a new electric vehicle lobbying group. Can you talk also about the top priorities for these kinds of organizations, because they might be actually quite different from the traditional automakers?
Yeah, absolutely. So actually, I think it might be best to start with Zeta, to start with this new lobbying group that just formed. In the past 3 or 4 months, actually, we've seen a real consolidation in how, let's say, climate tech companies, kind of tech, companies that are in the industries that we will rely on as we make this energy transition. So wind, solar, renewables, geothermal, and then electric cars. Like, we've seen them consolidate their lobbying efforts. So a number of different renewables companies came together, and there's now an American Clean Power Association. We also now see this organization, as you mentioned, called Zeta, which is Tesla and a number of other automakers, electric automakers, utilities, charging companies, and like other companies in the electric vehicle supply chain. So like lithium and copper mining and supply companies coming together to start lobbying the federal government on electric vehicle issues. And that's a big deal. And it gets exactly what we were talking about earlier about how when you accelerate the technology, you make the politics easier, and how politics and technology are like in a very symbiotic relationship. So 10 or 15 years ago, there was not Tesla, right? There were not these industries and companies that would lobby government like for their own well-being in their own right. All of that had to come from, or most of that had to come from environmentalists, most of that, or policymakers who were just trying to like kindle this industry into being. Now, those companies are very successful. I mean, Tesla has an enormous and frankly somewhat alarmingly large market cap. These are just big companies that make money. and they're able to, protect their self-interest in the same way that many other companies are. And they're now starting to, they form this new lobbying group that will push the federal government and push Congress specifically for EV-friendly legislation and EV-friendly funding and infrastructure and help building out the charging network so that people can drive their EVs across the country and not have to worry that they're not going to be able to find a charge. I think that is in some ways that illustrates where we're going on all of this, where the knack of the climate transition is to kind of stand up these industries with policy, continue to help them with policy, and then let them get to the point where they can fight for their own self-interest. Can you just repeat your question about the larger national? Oh, it was about GM, right?
Yeah, exactly, about cars.
So I think, so what we saw during the Trump administration was basically the car makers get repeatedly shafted by the Trump administration in the name of the oil industry. Fuel economy rules that were put in by the Obama administration at the end of their time and were perceived by, I think, most automakers as being too strict and too inflexible, but not unattainable, but within negotiating space, were completely gutted by the Trump administration. And in fact, they completely froze the fuel economy rules that were put in by the Obama administration. So instead of how it's been since 2009, where fuel economy for new American cars got a little better every year, the Trump administration said, actually, after 2020, it doesn't have to get better. You can just freeze at 2020 levels. It's a big deal for CO2 emissions because there was a lot of acceleration in the post-2020 standards. There would have just been a lot of carbon emissions that we could have averted if we had stayed on that glide path. What we saw was that, it takes a long time to make cars. Car companies are modern companies. They're extremely industrialized companies. They are super financialized. It takes a long time for them to make their products, right? They probably sell, in fact, they do sell the highest value consumer good in the economy. After homes, most people's most expensive possession is their car, and cars are consumer goods, in a slightly different way than homes are. So all these companies were preparing to meet the 2022 or 2023 strict emission standards. And the Trump administration said, actually, don't do that. It's a real big problem for companies because suddenly this investment they made isn't worth it. So what we saw is that 4 automakers, Ford, Honda, BMW, and VW, I believe, let's just say Ford, Honda, and VW, and a fourth to be named later that I've forgotten the name of, joined with California. And actually, because California has some legal authority to set its own standards, it negotiated a kind of watered down version of the Obama standards with California. And then those 4 automakers announced that they weren't going to follow the Trump standard. They would follow this new California standard, at which point the EPA and all the other automakers, including GM, sued them and said, you actually don't have the authority to do this. That lawsuit was continuing until Biden won, at which point 3 weeks later, after it became clear that, yes, Biden definitely won the presidential election, no matter what kind of stuff is happening in the courts, GM said, hey, actually, we've had a change of heart on this. We've decided we're all in on an electric future. We're right there with the new Biden administration, and we're going to pull out of this lawsuit with California. And actually, we're on California's side now. We want emissions regulations, even though just a few months earlier, they had basically sued California and said California didn't have any authority to do emissions regulations. So why does this matter? This matters, first of all, because it shows how just the raw politics involved in cars, that car companies are kind of willing to clown themselves like this. So for the sake of being on the right side of one administration or the other. It shows that car companies on the whole really got screwed by the Trump administration, frankly, for oil companies, because when you weaken fuel economy standards, what that means is you make gasoline sales go up. And third, I think it shows how cars are going to be the battleground of the new Biden administration on climate. Right now, transportation and specifically cars are the number one source of U.S. fossil fuels. I think 20% of all U.S. greenhouse gas emissions come from cars and light trucks. This is the new front. This is where the regulatory energy is going to be. It especially will be the source of where the fights are if Mary Nichols, who runs the California air regulator, becomes EPA administrator, as is being discussed. I think this kind of fight, over the kind of glide path for car companies going forward, how they're investing, and whether they're investing in the EV future and how much the federal government will make them invest and make them switch to EVs, is going to be the fight for the Biden administration, and is where the climate action at the federal level is probably going to be focused for the next 4 years.
Then shifting swiftly then to the international level, Andrew, the most common complaint about multilateral climate policy is that countries aren't truly bound to many agreements, unlike, of course, the laws that Rob was just talking about, the national level. In particular, the Paris Accord signees have largely failed to pass many of the policies that they envisioned. And even if they did, it likely wouldn't hit the agreement's targets. So, in the short time that we have left before we shift over to our audience's questions, can you tell us where's the hope for international climate action when there clearly remains this collective action problem?
Well, let me defend the Paris Agreement and then I'll turn to the other things that I totally agree need to shore it up. I don't think it's a fair characterization of the Paris Agreement. Look, except for the United States, essentially the entire world, their first commitment under the Paris Agreement, which they made in 2015, was to hit some targets, their own nationally determined targets by 2030. So here in 2020, even to sort of say that most of the policies that they should have committed to already aren't yet in place, I just don't think is an accurate characterization. We're going to have to wait and sort of see. Now's the time. You really got to see it go there. And the Paris Agreement was there is absolutely a disjunct between those original basket of commitments from over 190 parties under the Paris Agreement and the ultimate temperature target under the Paris Agreement. But that's by design. We thought when we were negotiating it that would be entirely vacuous to have heads of state, heads of government to come forward and commit to 2050 or 2100 targets as part of the condition for being part of the Paris Agreement, because those people would likely not be alive, right, and certainly not in government by the time that they would have to fulfill that. So you needed to get countries to commit to these 5-year cycles, right? So the original targets were for the first 5 years, and then we're now in 2020. This is a crucible year to figure out whether countries are committed to this process of increasing enhancing their targets every 5 years. So tomorrow, on the 5th year anniversary of the Paris Agreement, what we're going to see is a ceremony led by the UN and by Great Britain, which is the host of the next big climate summit in Glasgow this coming November. See how many countries are coming forward with new and enhanced targets. Europe did that today, right? The Europeans came forward and greatly enhanced their 2030 target to at least 55% reductions by 2030. Over a 40% reduction they originally committed to. Now they have got to now show us what are the policies and measures that they're going to put forward. The EU is kind of easy, right? Because they're always the climate good guys. But I think we're going to see that now. This is now the scrutiny that we'll place on the new Chinese targets. So President Xi goes to the UN last September, and he announced that China is now committed to some kind of enhanced target by 2030 and a longer-term target by 2060 for hitting net zero carbon emissions. Now we'll wait to see when their 14th 5-year plan is published this spring, are they putting forward the policies and measures that will do that? But you're totally right, it's not enough. And one of the weaker parts of it is that there are no binding penalties, right, in the Paris Agreement itself if you don't hit your target, other than you get drawn out, you get called out like people did with the Trump administration. Now they're doing with Brazil and kind of others and saying you're actually announcing that you're backtracking, and we know the laws that you're dismantling, that you said that you were going to be in place in order to hit your targets. We know that those are going away. But right, we had a trade-off, and the trade-off was we wanted greater participation, and to get there we sort of said the targets themselves are not legally binding. Do we need other measures? Absolutely. And they're going to come in other ways. And with time constraints, I'll only mention one, which is right on the horizon. Again, Europe's going to lead on this: border carbon adjustments. We're entering the world now where more and more countries are going to be putting a fee on goods and services that cross their borders from countries that do not have as strict emission reduction guidelines as they do. Europe's already started the sort of the public response period on their border carbon adjustment. They'll roll it out, we think, by 2023. They are entirely serious about this. They've got a comprehensive, very ambitious green, the European Green Deal program they put in place to sort of execute this. And so they got to protect their vulnerable industries, and they're going to do it. And they've got a carbon price that they'll be using as the sort of the litmus test on what other countries are doing. Biden has also said that he's in favor of some kind of border carbon adjustment. It's going to be harder if we don't have a pricing mechanism in the United States like they do in Europe, but there are other ways that we could do tariffs on incoming goods and services, and we'll see, like, are they going to try to do that in the early days of the new Biden administration to create something that looks similar, at least to the Europeans? And then that's going to start to put pressure on parties like China and India, and you just go down the board. And that is the kind of thing that, if you can make it compatible with the WTO and, hopefully sort of roll it out in such a way that it doesn't cause such an uproar and such pushback that you sort of shut down diplomatic relations with countries, that markets themselves, our ability to sell, right, in another country's markets, is going to become the de facto enforcement mechanism that you don't see in something like the Paris Agreement.
Very interesting. I mean, obviously, there's so many spaces to watch on this issue. It really just depends on the sort of angle you take. We're going to take a break shortly, but before we do, sorry, Rob, we'll come back to you after the break. Let's do we're just going to do a quick preview of next week's Power Lunch, which is a really amazing lineup to discuss U.S.-European relations. See if we can get that slide. Here we are. We're going to have Heather Conley from CSIS, Edward Luce, the fabulous columnist from the Financial Times, the U.S. national editor there, and also Celeste Wallander, who is formerly of the Obama National Security Council and one of the biggest experts on Russian politics in the world. Don't miss it next Friday, December 18th at 12 noon, right here on the Shar Schools YouTube channel. We'll take a quick break, and when we come back, we'll take your questions.
A world in motion. Our next generation of leaders needs new tools, sharper skills, leadership vision, and policy acumen to succeed in today's environment. A hands-on interdisciplinary education that offers a national and global perspective on the complexities of governance. The Shar School, a vision of excellence that melds theory with practice in the spirit of advancing the public good.
Welcome back. Let's take the first question from our audience to start off, because I know they've been patiently waiting. This is from Ethan, and he writes, should there be any concern that successes with adaptation will undercut the push for mitigation? And, I think, Rob, actually, that you kind of have a view of both sides of this, unlike other folks. Do you worry about that risk?
So this has historically been the big concern that you can't talk about, that like there's almost, it's one of those taboos where everyone talks about there being a taboo, but I'm not really sure there is a taboo, but everyone talks about it. That you can't talk about adaptation without decreasing kind of fervor around mitigation. I don't think so, frankly. At this point, we are going to see climate change. Like, we're going to see global warming. Global temperatures are going to continue to rise. They will likely exceed 1.5 C above the historic. I mean, there's no world where they don't exceed 1.5 C above the historic normal before we start to bring them down. It seems very likely they exceed 2 or 2.1 C before we start to bring them down. And to just translate that into terms, that is equivalent to like 8 to 11 degrees Fahrenheit on land. And it's a really big climatic difference. Again, on average, but there it is. I don't think there is. I don't think we have to be worried about that kind of moral hazard, because first of all, we need to adapt and we need to mitigate. We just need to do both things. So, it's like having a broken arm and being on antibiotics for like cuts, like you just need both of them. I think at the same time, I also think that what we've seen politically, and almost like what we've seen during the pandemic, is that a lot of issues where we perceive there to be trade-offs, there are not necessarily trade-offs. And in fact, action begets further action. At the beginning of the pandemic, we talked about how there was this kind of a priori statement of what the trade-off was going to be that we heard about, which was you could fight the virus or you could preserve the economy. And what we've seen at an international level is that that wasn't really true. Countries that fought the virus the most vigorously then got their economy back. Countries that didn't fight the virus very well also didn't get their economies back very well. We're even now seeing this in the US, where the jobs numbers are starting to fall apart on the back of our third surge. So I think in some ways it's analogous to climate change here, because the more we do on mitigation, the more we do on adaptation, and the more we kind of bring the reality of climate change into our political system and get used to thinking about it, the more we'll be able to do on mitigation too. I just don't really think there's a trade-off, especially not in the world that we're in right now, where interest rates are so low and we have so much fiscal room to make public investments. It's just the only kind of limit on this conversation at the national level is political. The state and city level, like they need money from the federal government, but at the national level, it's only a political constraint on these decisions.
I cannot imagine that, Janie, you would disagree terribly, but what would you say?
No, I don't disagree at all. I'd love to jump in here. I mean, as an adaptation planner, I've been in adaptation for the last 15 years. It's what I do. And I have to say that the only reason that I am still invested in adaptation is because I think that we have the ability to cut emissions and actually curb the rate of climate change. My job becomes impossible if we are not taking that action. I coordinate very, very closely with my sister office in the city, the Mayor's Office of Sustainability, which is working on that work to cut our carbon emissions. We actually have staff that report to both offices just so we can stay incredibly coordinated. But I also just want to point out that the further out we look, and if we look at high emission scenarios that don't take decarbonization efforts into account, the work becomes much harder and the choices are not attractive, right? I mean, that's when we're already in many places across the country looking at having to relocate entire communities. This is incredibly disruptive. It is incredibly inconvenient. I don't think that anybody who is facing the prospect of relocation or retreat, as we often call it, will say that adaptation is the answer, right? Like, it is not a long-term sustainable answer. It can help buy us time, but we have to do it because we've already lost too much time. But those efforts have to absolutely be coupled with our efforts to cut carbon emissions.
Good. This is we'll take one more question. This one's from Tim O'Shea. He asks, what is one thing that each of us can do to improve climate change from each of your perspectives? So I guess we can do a little round robin here, and so perhaps we'll start with you, Andrew. What is the one thing that you would recommend that individuals can do to take action to improve the plight?
My answer to this used to be a little tongue-in-cheek, and I would say move to California. If California has a comprehensive pricing system, and so all of your emissions in California are covered under some policy and measure designed to reduce emissions, which you don't have to do much other than just live there. But we'll move to something else. And I think that really here, I guess there's two things, and they go together. And one is just simply become a climate aware voter. Don't stand for, someone else had put into the chat, like, this stuff, you guys make it sound so common sense. Like, why would anyone disagree with it? And it's partly because has been a concentrated effort that's well documented to basically make you doubt the science or doubt the impacts or doubt the severity or doubt the idea that humans are responsible for this at all. And it's terrible. It's not unlike a lot of other kind of anti-science movements that we've seen in the United States in the past. And I'm not thinking about what's been going on with COVID. Going back to, the advertisements used to appear in newspapers, but saying, most doctors say that smoking won't kill you. So there's been a concentrated effort there, which you need to educate yourself about and need to be aware of, and then begin to really look at what are the climate plans of different people who run for office. How seriously do they take this issue? I agree with Rob. We have reached an inflection point in the Democratic Party on this. I think we could possibly get there across the entire American electorate. Most Americans think, at this point, 70% think climate change is real, caused by humans. But they're still throwing this enormous amount, right, of, frankly, garbage at them. And it used to be doubting the science. Now it's like, if you think that the solutions to climate change necessarily are some kind of socialism which are designed to destroy the economy. And thank goodness that Joe Biden sort of figured out that the way you got to frame this, which is absolutely true, which is that you can create jobs on the mitigation side, on the adaptation side, and resilience side. You can create jobs by attending to climate change, good paying jobs, that are sustainable over the long run, and that can also help us to be more resilient to problems like the one we're dealing with in the pandemic.
Thanks, Andrew. Janie, do you want to share your thoughts about what you tell folks?
Sure. And I will really build off of what Andrew just said. I think becoming a climate aware voter is really important. At the local level, I would go even further than that. Ask your local officials how they are taking climate into account in every decision that they make, whether it's a land use decision, whether it's an infrastructure decision. It doesn't have to look like a climate decision to be a climate decision. We need to start accounting for climate change in every action and every investment that local governments are making, especially on the adaptation side. And it is up to citizens to hold their public officials accountable. I will say that the biggest asset I have in my job is that I serve a constituency here in New York City that is demanding climate action, that is demanding adaptation action. It is, of course, fueled by the fact that we experienced Hurricane Sandy 8 years ago, and people don't want to see that happen again. But memories are short, and the impact of that is not going away. People are also seeing tidal flooding every time there's a high tide, monthly tidal flooding in some of the lowest lying communities in New York City. They're demanding action, and it helps me do my job because local officials face so many urgent problems that they have to deal with. Climate change can feel far off, but in New York City, they're saying we can't wait, and that is what enables me to bring my recommendations for policy change, for projects, for investments to decision makers to get the job done.
Thanks, Janie. Rob, what's one more thing we can do?
So I want to go back to something Andrew was actually saying when he was talking about the Paris Agreement, which is that the way these plans are designed, the way the Paris Agreement is designed, is for countries to kind of continue to increase their ambition, for them to continue to ramp up their climate plans to meet that temperature target of 2 degrees Celsius of warming in the future, right, in 2050 or 2055. Part of that is because we don't know how to fully decarbonize the economy yet. I think this is a little bit of one of the things that we all dance around a little bit, in part because we know how to decarbonize a lot of the economy, and we could be doing it now, and we could be doing it a lot faster, but we don't know yet how to do the whole economy. And we're only going to figure out how to do the whole economy by starting with the parts that we do know and moving quickly together as a democracy and as all the parts of that democracy. I think that is important to know if you want to start taking action. That's an important thing to keep in mind, because what it means is that, we need you in the fight. We need you as an educated person in every respect to participate in this, not just as a voter, but to call your members of Congress, if you're lucky enough to live outside DC like I do, and you have them, to call your members of Congress when they take a stand, to just try to track how this is acting, to call your local officials and to get involved at a local level, as Janie was saying, and push for more action, to get your company involved and to get your company to where it's buying more renewable energy as an employee or as a manager, or in whatever role if you work at a university, as an institution, to get where it has its own carbon, its own approach to climate change and is not contributing to this problem, to get your electrical utility. And if you have one, a natural gas utility, to kind of wean yourself off the natural gas utility, because there isn't a world where we're fully decarbonized and we have such a thing as natural gas utilities, just saying it. To get involved as a consumer, customer, in all those institutions in which you're enmeshed, and push for more action. I think one place that we don't talk about enough here is that there is actually stuff you can do as a consumer that matters. And you shouldn't think about it as reducing your carbon footprint, because I think carbon footprint is like kind of a meaningless statistic, because frankly, as an American, no matter what, like there's so much outside of our control. It's just like, I don't think we should think of ourselves as responsible for carbon in the way that having a carbon footprint suggests. However, what you can do is help buy things which then decrease their costs and let other people buy them, including in places outside the US. So if you're looking at a new car purchase and you mostly use your car for driving around town, making small trips, even if you're doing long trips, this is possible. But especially if you mostly use your car for errands, this is going to be maybe a second car, it should be an EV, period. It should just be an EV. Absolutely, if you're doing mostly city driving around town, EV, no question. If you're putting in a new water heater, look at putting in an electric water heater, not a natural gas water heater, because that's going to matter a lot. If you're looking at putting in a new stove and oven, look at buying an induction stove. They're really good now, and chefs really actually do like them. That's going to do a lot, both for the climate and for kind of reducing the costs of an induction stove and an electric oven, and for also improving your health, because it turns out having a mini natural gas power plant in your house is like really bad for your lungs. Is going to do a lot there. So I would say what we need people to do is to sign on to the idea that this is a life's work for each and every one of us, and that it will require action in every institution that we're enmeshed with, and then just start somewhere and find something to care about and go.
Thanks so much, Rob. Usually we don't end power lunches with homework, but in this one, I think our viewers have some. Thank you all very much for joining the broadcast. Don't forget, next week at 12 o'clock noon, we'll be joined by Heather Conley, Ed Luce from the Financial Times, and Celeste Wallander from the formerly of the National Security Council and now at the U.S.-Russia Foundation, for a fantastic panel shifting to foreign policy, looking at U.S.-European relations. That's all for us today. We're very, very grateful to have our guests on, Janie Bavishi, Andrew Light, and Robinson Meyer. And to the rest of you, have a wonderful weekend, and we'll see you soon enough.
Thank you.
Thank you.